Thomas Harrison was one of the most formidable military commanders in 17th century England. Rising through the ranks as a Puritan major general, he became a driving force in the Civil War that dismantled the British monarchy. Driven by unyielding religious conviction, his most consequential act was signing the death warrant of King Charles I, viewing the execution not as treason, but as a divine mandate. When King Charles II restored the monarchy in 1660, Harrison faced his brutal execution with defiance, famously striking the executioner across the face before passing away. Beyond this final act, he left a lasting mark on British history, rising from modest beginnings to become an unyielding leader who challenged the supreme power of the crown. Thomas Harrison was born in Staffordshire in 1616 to a rising middle-class family. His father was a respected local mayor who also happened to make a living as a butcher. Years later, Harrison's political rivals weaponized this specific detail to mock his background. They distributed pamphlets portraying him as a common slaughterer, implying he handled complex government affairs with a meat cleaver. Despite these political smears, Harrison was never meant for a life of physical labor. His parents recognized his sharp mind early on and paid for a proper formal education. He left his quiet provincial hometown for London to study the rigorous systems of English law. This move placed him directly into an elite, formally educated professional circle, proving his critics entirely wrong. Harrison began his professional life working as a clerk for an attorney named Thomas Holker at Clifford's Inn. Clifford's Inn was one of the historic inns of Chancery, the preparatory legal institutions of London that served as the gateway to the Inns of Court and the English bar. This rigorous legal foundation is the crucial master key to decoding Harrison's entire subsequent life and his most controversial actions. At Clifford's Inn, he was trained to look at the world strictly through the lens of legal statutes, historical precedents, overlapping jurisdictions, and constitutional rights. The common law of England was a dense, centuries-old labyrinth of property rights and royal prerogatives. Harrison learned how to dissect arguments, identify the legal authority of different courts, and understand the precise mechanisms of state power. Consequently, every unprecedented military action he later executed on the battlefield was entirely justified within his own mind. Similarly, when he helped dismantle ancient political institutions in Parliament, he grounded those radical decisions in strict arguments regarding constitutionality, local jurisdiction, and the due process of law. He was never a man of mindless, chaotic rage. He was a man of unrelenting, calculated order. When the First English Civil War erupted in 1642, pitching the uncompromising divine right authority of King Charles I directly against the elected representatives of Parliament, Harrison did not hesitate. The legal clerk traded his text for a cavalry sword. He initially enlisted in the prestigious Life Guard of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, who was then serving as the Captain General of the Parliamentarian forces. However, the early parliamentary armies were plagued by inefficiency, divided loyalties, and a command structure based entirely on aristocratic birth rather than military competence. Harrison found his true calling, his ultimate military capability, and his spiritual home when Parliament passed the Self-Denying Ordinance and formed the New Model Army in 1645. The New Model Army was an entirely new concept in British military history. It was not a traditional, unreliable mercenary force, nor was it commanded by men simply because they held inherited titles. It was a professional, strictly disciplined, and ideologically driven national army where promotion was based entirely on battlefield merit and tactical capability. In this meritocratic environment, Harrison proved to be a military prodigy. He possessed an innate tactical brilliance, a deep understanding of cavalry logistics, and a fearless aggression in charges. Fighting with distinction in pivotal engagements, he rose with lightning speed through the ranks, eventually achieving the status of Major General, commanding thousands of the most disciplined and effective cavalrymen in Europe. Yet the new model army was fundamentally more than just an efficient military machine. As these soldiers marched across the country, fought brutal battles, and watched their comrades die for years on end, the army camps became massive, mobile incubators for radical political thought and intense burning Puritan zeal. The soldiers were not just fighting for their pay, they were fighting for God. Within these heavily politicized ranks, surrounded by radical preachers and engaging in constant fervent prayer, Harrison underwent a profound psychological and spiritual transformation. He emerged not just as a military leader, but as a leading ideological figure among a rapidly growing religious faction known as the Fifth Monarchists. To modern analysts, the Fifth Monarchists might sound like a fringe apocalyptic cult, but in the mid-17th century, they were a significantly influential, heavily armed political religious movement. Their ideology was based on a strict, unyielding interpretation of the apocalyptic prophecies found in the Bible, specifically the prophetic visions detailed in the book of Daniel. They firmly believed that human history was rigidly and divinely divided into 5 distinct eras. The 4 great corrupted earthly empires of the past, which they identified as Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, associating the Roman Empire with the current Catholic Church and the authoritarian monarchies of Europe, were all destined by God to violently collapse. From their smoking ashes, the 5th monarchy would rise. This would not be a metaphorical awakening, but a perfect, utopian earthly kingdom where Jesus Christ would physically return to earth to rule alongside his saints for 1,000 years of enduring peace and justice. For Thomas Harrison, the bloody, grueling battles of the English Civil War were no longer merely about taxation without representation, parliamentary privilege, or worldly political power. This was an undeniable holy war. He genuinely, fervently believed he was a divine instrument, specifically commanded by God to clear the physical ground for the imminent kingdom of heaven. He viewed the military victories of the new model army not as tactical successes, but as undeniable proof of divine providence. In this uncompromising apocalyptic theological framework, King Charles I was no longer viewed simply as a politically incompetent ruler, a poor military strategist, or a stubborn, deceptive politician. To Harrison and the 5th Monarchists, the king was identified as the Antichrist, an active living agent of worldly corruption who was deliberately and violently obstructing the divine plan of God. This radical ideology began to harden into an uncompromising, deeply rigid framework by the year 1646, a period marking the definitive end of the First Civil War. Charles I had been militarily defeated, his army scattered, and he was eventually taken into custody by parliamentary forces. The moderate factions within the English Parliament, desperate for peace and stability, spent months attempting to negotiate a constitutional settlement that would keep Charles on the throne with heavily limited powers. They sought a return to the traditional order, merely modified to prevent future tyranny. But for Major General Thomas Harrison, the time for traditional legal settlements had passed. The theological timeline was ticking, and the King of England remained the primary biological and political obstacle to the establishment of the rule of the saints. The ideological hardening of Major General Thomas Harrison and the New Model Army was not an overnight phenomenon. It was forged in the crucible of profound political betrayal. To understand the transition from fighting a political war to initiating a regicide, one must examine the events of 1647 and 1648. Following the defeat of the Royalist forces in the First English Civil War, King Charles I was held in honorable captivity. The moderate factions within the English Parliament, dominated by conservative Presbyterians, were desperate to restore national stability. They engaged in protracted negotiations with the king, seeking a constitutional settlement that would reinstate him on the throne with limited powers and establish a national Presbyterian church. However, Charles I possessed a deeply entrenched, inflexible belief in the divine right of kings. He viewed any limitation on his sovereign authority as a sin against God. Consequently, he treated the negotiations with Parliament not as a path to peace, but as a tactical delay. While publicly engaging in diplomatic talks with the English Parliament, Charles secretly opened a clandestine channel with a faction of Scottish nobles. In December 1647, Charles signed a secret treaty known as the Engagement. In exchange for a promise to impose Presbyterianism in England for a trial period of 3 years, the Scottish agreed to raise a massive army, invade England, and violently restore Charles to his full, unmitigated royal authority. This cynical political maneuver ignited the Second English Civil War in 1648. The resulting conflict was not a gentlemanly dispute. It was a series of localized, savagely brutal uprisings across England and Wales, coupled with a massive Scottish invasion from the north. The New Model Army, exhausted from years of fighting and severely underpaid by the civilian government, was forced to mobilize once again to crush the Royalist revolts and repel the invading Scottish forces. Thousands of English and Scottish men were slaughtered on battlefields like Preston and Colchester. For the commanders of the New Model Army, including Thomas Harrison, Oliver Cromwell, and Henry Ireton, this was the ultimate unforgivable betrayal. The king had deliberately plunged the nation back into the horrors of war simply to preserve his earthly power. It broke something fundamental in their relationship with the concept of the monarchy. In April 1648, before marching out to face the Royalist uprisings, the High Command and the officers of the New Model Army gathered at Windsor Castle for a fervent 3-day prayer meeting. This assembly was a critical psychological and theological turning point in British history. The officers sought divine explanation for the renewed bloodshed. In their strict Puritan theology, earthly events were direct reflections of divine judgment. They concluded that the Second Civil War was a punishment from God because they, the army, had attempted to negotiate with a corrupt monarch instead of delivering divine justice. During this meeting, the commanders turned to the Old Testament, specifically focusing on the book of Numbers, chapter 35, verse 33. Blood defiles the land, and no atonement can be made for the land, except by the blood of him who shed it. This was not a metaphorical reading. It was adopted as a strict, binding legal statute. The army leadership officially and collectively labeled King Charles I as that man of blood. This designation fundamentally altered the legal and political status of the king. He was no longer recognized by the army as a sovereign monarch or a political opponent. He was legally and spiritually defined as a mass murderer. He was held personally and criminally responsible for the sheer scale of casualties and destruction inflicted across the British Isles. From this exact moment for Thomas Harrison, the concept of negotiating a treaty with the crown was no longer merely a bad political strategy. It was a direct, damnable sin against God. The physical destruction of the monarchy was transformed into a divine sentence that the army was duty-bound to carry out. The theological framework demanded execution, and Harrison possessed the military capability and the legal mind to engineer it. By the winter of 1648, the new model army had successfully crushed the royalist uprisings and annihilated the Scottish invading force. The king was once again a prisoner. However, the political crisis in London reached a critical deadlock. Despite the treachery of the Second Civil War, the moderate majority in the House of Commons, deeply concerned by the radical, Republican, and Fifth Monarchist ideologies festering within the army, still held on to the illusion that they could negotiate a final treaty with Charles. They initiated the Treaty of Newport, reopening formal diplomatic channels with the defeated king. The civilian politicians essentially voted to pretend the Second Civil War had never happened, prioritizing traditional social order over the Army's demand for radical justice. Thomas Harrison and the military high command recognized a stark reality. If Parliament successfully voted to reinstate the king, the revolution would be entirely undone. Their holy war would be lost. Their ideological cause would be dismantled, and they would all undoubtedly be executed as traitors the moment Charles regained his executive authority. Harrison understood that they could no longer rely on the standard legislative process. The elected government was actively obstructing the will of God and the safety of the army. Therefore, the civilian government had to be structurally dismantled. Harrison applied the cold structural logic he had learned as a law clerk to the mechanics of a military coup d'etat. On the freezing morning of December 6, 1648, the new model army executed a brazen, meticulously planned assault against the elected government of England. Under the strategic direction of Thomas Harrison, and backed by the overwhelming threat of his heavily armed cavalry regiments, stationed strategically across London to prevent civilian riots, Colonel Thomas Pride marched a detachment of seasoned soldiers directly to the doors of the House of Commons at the Palace of Westminster. This event, known to history as Pride's Purge, was not a chaotic riot. It was a strictly organized, legally structured military operation designed to surgically remove the conservative wing of the English legislature. Colonel Pride stood at the entrance of the parliamentary chamber holding a specific, meticulously compiled list of names. Beside him stood Lord Grey of Groby, a radical nobleman who personally identified the arriving politicians, ensuring no targets slipped past the guards. As the members of Parliament arrived to conduct the daily business of the nation, specifically to vote on the acceptance of the Treaty of Newport, they were systematically intercepted. Pride and his soldiers physically barred entry to or actively arrested every single member of Parliament who was known to favor continuing negotiations with King Charles. The operation was ruthless. Soldiers forcibly dragged protesting, widely respected politicians away from the steps of government, locking them in temporary freezing confinement in a nearby tavern mockingly nicknamed Hell. In a single morning, over 140 elected members of Parliament were purged from the government by military force. The remaining minority, consisting of roughly 80 active members, became derisively known by royalists as the Rump Parliament. This purged body was entirely sympathetic to and entirely dependent upon the military power of the new model army. The Rump Parliament was immediately transformed into a compliant legislative tool designed solely to pave a legal path for the king's trial and execution. This aggressive use of military force to cleanse an elected sovereign legislative body revealed the ruthless core of Harrison's logic. When the constitutional laws of men stand in direct opposition to the perceived justice of God, the institutions of men must be violently smashed. He had utilized the army not just to win a war, but to completely rewrite the constitutional architecture of the state in a matter of hours. Following the successful execution of Pride's Purge, the Army High Command required a commander possessing unshakable ideological purity and nerve for a sensitive, deeply symbolic logistical mission. King Charles I was currently being held prisoner in the bleak, isolated confines of Hurst Castle. Hurst Castle was a grim, heavily fortified Tudor artillery fortress situated on a narrow, desolate shingle, spit projecting into the Solent on the southern coast of England. The isolation of the fortress was intentional, designed to prevent any royalist rescue attempts. However, the king now needed to be transported to Windsor Castle, closer to London, to await the newly purged Parliament's next move. Thomas Harrison was specifically selected and given the command to retrieve the monarch. In the mind of King Charles I, Major General Thomas Harrison was a figure of profound terror. Charles, isolated in the freezing, damp coastal fortress, had been fed a steady stream of rumors and royalist intelligence regarding the radical factions of the army. He had been explicitly warned about Harrison's fifth monarchist beliefs. The king's advisors portrayed Harrison as a rough, low-born, fanatical butcher who'd been dispatched by the army to assassinate him in the dark. Paradoxically, Charles almost welcomed the idea of assassination. To the king's deeply entrenched aristocratic and autocratic mind, a quiet murder in the night, while tragic, would preserve the divine dignity and mystique of the crown. Assassination was a recognized, albeit brutal, mechanism of European statecraft. It would render him a holy martyr without subjecting the sacred institution of the monarchy to the public humiliation of accountability. A king could be murdered, but a king could not be judged. But when the monarch and the major general finally met and rode side by side toward Windsor, Harrison completely and methodically dismantled the king's expectations. Historical accounts of their journey reveal a profound psychological clash between the ancient world of divine right and the new world of militant, puritanical meritocracy. Harrison did not look or act like a low-born assassin. He arrived impeccably dressed, riding a magnificent horse, and commanding his troops with crisp, professional military authority. He treated the king with strict, cold military courtesy, but offered zero traditional royal deference. He did not bow, and he did not treat Charles as a sovereign superior. During the ride, Charles, unable to contain his anxiety, confronted Harrison directly regarding the persistent rumors of a planned assassination. Harrison looked the King of England in the eye and publicly, coldly rejected any notion of a back-alley murder. Harrison declared with unwavering authority that Charles would not be killed in the shadows. He informed the monarch that whatever happened to him would be public, transparent, and legally documented. Harrison famously stated that the army's actions regarding the crown would be clear as the sun. That single phrase struck more fear into the king than any physical threat of violence. It signaled the beginning of a systematic, institutionalized prosecution of a sovereign monarch. It meant that Charles would be forced to stand in a courtroom, not as the divine source of the law, but as a mortal subject bound by it. This was a concept entirely alien to the 17th century European mind, an event completely unprecedented in human history. Harrison was not offering the king a quiet, dignified exit. He was promising a total public dismantling of the concept of sovereign immunity. The legal clerk from Staffordshire was preparing to put the divine right of kings on trial, setting the stage for a legal earthquake that would permanently alter the trajectory of Western civilization. The logistical delivery of King Charles I to Windsor Castle by Major General Thomas Harrison was merely the physical prelude to a monumental constitutional crisis. Having secured the person of the monarch, the radical military and political coalition led by Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, and Thomas Harrison faced a staggering, historically unprecedented legal impossibility. They had resolved to put the king on trial, but the entire structural framework of English common law possessed no mechanism to do so. The English judicial system operated on the ancient, fundamental legal maxim of rex non potest peccare, the king can do no wrong. Because all courts in England operated strictly in the name of the king, and all laws were enacted by the supreme authority of the king, it was a legal paradox to charge the sovereign with a crime. He was the physical source of the law, therefore, he logically could not violate it. Furthermore, a charge of high treason was historically and statutorily defined as an act of rebellion or conspiracy committed against the king. Charging the King of England with treason against himself was a logical absurdity that paralyzed the conservative legal minds of the era. The highest judges in the land, including the chief justices of the King's Bench and the Common Pleas, categorically refused to participate in the proceedings, declaring them entirely devoid of legal foundation. Harrison's foundational legal training at the Inns of Chancery became highly relevant during this chaotic, unprecedented period. He understood that to execute the king legally, the revolutionary government could not rely on existing statutes. They had to invent an entirely new legal reality and a new definition of sovereignty. When the House of Lords, the upper chamber of Parliament, consisting of the hereditary aristocracy, categorically and unanimously refused to participate in or endorse the trial of the monarch, the purged House of Commons, the Rump Parliament, took a revolutionary legislative step. On January 4th, 1649, the House of Commons unilaterally passed a series of resolutions that fundamentally altered the British Constitution. They declared that the people were, under God, the original of all just power. Consequently, they declared that the House of Commons, being the elected representatives of the people, possessed the supreme power in the nation. They legally bypassed the House of Lords and bypassed the requirement for the king's royal assent. Operating on this newly invented unilateral constitutional authority, the Rump Parliament drafted an ordinance creating a judicial tribunal that had never existed in the history of the realm, the High Court of Justice. This specialized court was granted unprecedented jurisdiction to try Charles Stuart, King of England, for the high crimes of tyranny, treason, and mass murder. The legal charge was ingeniously and radically reframed by the prosecuting attorneys. Charles was not charged with treason against the crown, but with treason against the people of England. The indictment argued that the king had possessed a limited delegated power to govern according to the laws of the land, but he had harbored a wicked design to erect an unlimited tyrannical power. By raising an army and levying war against his own subjects during the First and Second Civil Wars, he was legally classified as a traitor to the nation. The trial of King Charles I commenced on January 20th, 1649, within the cavernous, heavily guarded walls of Westminster Hall. It was a spectacle of intense legal, political, and military friction. The physical layout of the court was designed to strip the king of his traditional authority. The commissioners of the High Court of Justice sat on tiered benches draped in black, acting as both judges and jury. The president of the court, John Bradshaw, wore a specialized steel-lined hat, fearing assassination by royalist sympathizers in the galleries. When King Charles was brought into the hall, he deliberately refused to remove his hat, a highly visible, calculated sign of disrespect and a refusal to acknowledge the authority of the court. Charles I, maintaining his unyielding belief in his divine right, flatly refused to enter a plea of either guilty or not guilty. He engaged in a brilliant, legally sound defensive strategy. He consistently demanded to know by what lawful authority he had been brought to the bar. He argued eloquently that no earthly court, and certainly no court established by a fractured, purged half-parliament backed by military force, possessed the jurisdiction to judge a sovereign monarch. "I have a trust committed to me by God, by old and lawful descent," Charles declared to the commissioners. "I will not betray it to answer to a new unlawful authority." The king argued that the tribunal was nothing more than an illegal military junta, masking its violence behind a fragile facade of justice. By refusing to plead, Charles paralyzed the standard criminal procedure. Under 17th century English law, a trial could not proceed to the examination of evidence and witnesses if the defendant refused to enter a plea. For 3 consecutive days, President Bradshaw and the king engaged in a tense, repetitive legal standoff. Bradshaw asserted the supreme authority of the Commons of England. Charles rejected it as an illegal usurpation of power. Thomas Harrison sat on the benches among the commissioners watching the procedural deadlock. The military commanders understood that if they allowed the king to continue dominating the legal arguments, public sympathy would shift dangerously in his favor. Recognizing that Charles would never recognize the court, the High Court of Justice eventually bypassed standard legal procedure. They ruled that his refusal to plead pro confesso as an admission of guilt. They proceeded to examine witnesses in a closed committee, hearing testimony regarding the king's direct involvement in the bloodshed of the civil wars, before returning to Westminster Hall for the final judgment. Despite the king's formidable legal defense, the ultimate outcome of the trial was predetermined by the overwhelming military power holding the City of London. On January 27, 1649, the High Court of Justice formally declared Charles Stuart guilty of high treason and murder, sentencing him to death by severing his head from his body. However, reading a verdict in a courtroom and actually executing God's anointed monarch in the streets of London were 2 vastly different logistical and psychological propositions. As the gravity of what they were doing began to fully dawn on the commissioners of the High Court, widespread panic set in. The political and personal risks were astronomical. The commissioners suddenly realized the massive historical, geopolitical, and potentially spiritual consequences of committing regicide. They were actively inviting the military wrath of every major monarchy in Europe, specifically France and Spain, who would view the execution as a direct threat to the institution of royalty itself. They faced the fury of the vast majority of the English population, who remained deeply conservative and monarchist. Most significantly, many commissioners feared the damnation of their own souls for striking down a king who claimed his authority directly from God. Men who had loudly condemned the king in the safety of closed parliamentary sessions days earlier suddenly feigned severe illness, fled the city of London entirely, or outright refused to sign the final physical death warrant. The entire revolutionary process threatened to collapse into bureaucratic chaos and cowardice just inches from the finish line. Major General Thomas Harrison felt zero such fear, hesitation, or political doubt, while other men wavered, fearful of the historical precedent they were setting and the potential for future royalist retaliation. Harrison was driven by an ironclad, uncompromising theological certainty. He, alongside Oliver Cromwell, became the driving force ensuring the execution was carried out. Harrison actively pressured, cajoled, and coerced the hesitant commissioners to step up to the table in the Painted Chamber and sign the parchment. Out of the 135 commissioners originally appointed to the High Court of Justice by the Rump Parliament, only 59 ultimately possessed the nerve to sign the death warrant of King Charles I. Thomas Harrison's signature was the 12th name applied to the document. If one examines the original historical parchment, which survives today in the archives of the House of Lords, the stark contrast between the signatures is a physical testament to the psychological state of the men in the room. Many commissioners signed with small, shaky, rushed, or nearly illegible script, visually betraying their terror and reluctance. Harrison's pen strokes, however, are entirely distinct. His signature is bold, heavy, and undeniably decisive. There is no tremor in the ink, no hesitation in the physical act of condemning the monarch to death. He did not fear the judgment of future historians, the retaliation of exiled princes, or the political fallout of establishing a republic. In his apocalyptic worldview, he was not signing a mundane political document drafted by ambitious men. He was signing a divine warrant drafted by God himself, executing a murderer to cleanse the blood from the land of England. He had destroyed the ancient laws of men to fulfill the prophecies of heaven, and he was fully prepared to accept whatever earthly consequences that holy act required. On January 30th, 1649, the sentence was carried out. King Charles I stepped out of a window of the banqueting house in Whitehall onto a wooden scaffold draped in black. Following a brief speech, he laid his head upon the block, and the executioner severed it with a single blow. As the executioner held the head aloft, a contemporary witness famously recorded that the massive crowd gathered in the street did not cheer. Instead, they let out a dismal universal groan, a sound of profound collective trauma. But for Thomas Harrison and the Fifth Monarchists, that sound marked the definitive end of the old, corrupt world. The man of blood had been purged. The physical and spiritual ground had been cleared for the next stage of divine history. In the immediate aftermath of the regicide, the political architecture of the British Isles was fundamentally rebuilt. In February and March of 1649, the Rump Parliament officially abolished the office of the monarchy, declaring it unnecessary, burdensome, and dangerous to the liberty, safety, and public interest of the people. They simultaneously abolished the House of Lords, completely dismantling the ancient aristocratic wing of the legislature. England was officially declared a commonwealth, a republic governed solely by the elected representatives of the people in the House of Commons. To handle the executive functions of the government previously managed by the king and his privy council, Parliament created the Council of State. With the king dead and the royalist armies completely shattered, Major General Thomas Harrison reached the zenith of his earthly political and military power. He was no longer just a highly effective cavalry commander. He was universally recognized as one of the central, indispensable pillars of the New English Republic. His close, enduring alliance with Oliver Cromwell, combined with his fierce popularity among the radicalized rank-and-file soldiers of the New Model Army, elevated him to a position of staggering national influence. Harrison was immediately appointed to the newly formed Council of State. At the age of just 33, the butcher's son from Staffordshire was now one of the primary executive leaders of the nation, commanding immense military resources and shaping domestic and foreign policy. However, the new Commonwealth government faced a massive logistical, military, and security nightmare. While London and the eastern counties were firmly under the control of Parliament and the New Model Army, vast geographically difficult regions of the British Isles remained fiercely loyal to the exiled Stuart monarchy, now represented by Charles II, and deeply hostile to the radical religious sects that now controlled the capital, one of the most dangerous, unstable, and strategically vital regions was Wales. Wales was a rugged, mountainous, and geographically impenetrable royalist stronghold. The population was deeply conservative, heavily Anglican, culturally distinct, and notoriously resistant to the puritanical, centralized reforms radiating from London. To secure the western flank of the new republic and prevent Wales from being used as a staging ground for a royalist invasion from Ireland or the continent, the government required a military governor who possessed both tactical ruthlessness and efficient administrative capabilities. They chose Major General Thomas Harrison. In 1650, Parliament granted Harrison supreme military and civil control over the entirety of Wales. However, Harrison did not view his assignment merely as a standard military occupation designed to suppress rebellion. Drawing upon his fifth monarchist convictions, he viewed Wales not just as a political threat, but as a spiritually barren landscape that desperately required divine illumination and structural purification. He intended to govern not merely as a secular general, but as a heavily armed radical missionary. To facilitate this massive social and religious overhaul, Parliament passed a specific, unprecedented piece of legislation, the Act for the Better Propagation and Preaching of the Gospel in Wales. This act granted Harrison and a hand-picked committee of roughly 70 radical commissioners almost dictatorial, unchecked powers over the entire Welsh religious, economic, and educational infrastructure. Harrison's administration of Wales over the next 3 years was a fascinating blend of military efficiency and extreme theological engineering. He applied the cold, structural, legal logic he had learned as a clerk at Clifford's Inn to the subjective business of religious conversion. Recognizing that the traditional Anglican clergy embedded in the local communities were staunch royalist sympathizers who actively opposed the Republic and preached against the government, Harrison initiated a systematic, aggressive purge of the Welsh parishes. Utilizing the legal authority of the Propagation Act, Harrison's commissioners evaluated every clergyman in Wales. They forcibly ejected hundreds of established Anglican ministers from their pulpits, officially accusing them of being corrupt, ungodly, ignorant, or politically subversive. In their place, Harrison did not attempt to install a new, rigid, state-controlled hierarchy. Instead, he completely restructured the ecclesiastical economy of the region. Harrison utilized the legal power of the state to seize the massive financial assets, glebe lands, and mandatory tithes of the Welsh Church. He redirected these vast funds to finance a highly mobile, aggressive network of itinerant, radical preachers. These men, including prominent radical figures like Vavasor Powell and Morgan Llwyd, were not assigned to specific static parishes. They traversed the harsh Welsh landscape on horseback, moving rapidly from town to town, preaching militant Puritanism, apocalyptic fifth monarchist theology, and demanding absolute political loyalty to the Commonwealth. They bypassed the traditional church structures, preaching in open fields, marketplaces, and town squares. Furthermore, Harrison recognized that long-term ideological control and the eradication of royalist sympathies required the aggressive indoctrination of the next generation. He utilized the seized state funds to establish dozens of free, Puritan-run schools across Wales. These schools were designed to teach literacy in both English and Welsh, specifically so the population could read the Bible directly, thereby breaking the intellectual monopoly of the traditional Anglican elite. During his tenure, Major General Thomas Harrison operated with the authority of an uncrowned king in the West. He commanded the military garrisons that enforced order. He controlled the regional economy through the seizure and redistribution of royalist estates and church tithes, and he aggressively dictated the spiritual lives of hundreds of thousands of citizens. Unsurprisingly, his ruthless efficiency, combined with his radical religious agenda, bred massive, deeply entrenched resentment. Conservative elites, displaced clergymen, and traditionalist politicians launched vicious, sustained propaganda campaigns against him in London. They flooded the capital with pamphlets accusing Harrison of embezzling vast sums of church tithes, operating a corrupt, tyrannical fiefdom, and ruling Wales with unnecessary military brutality. While rigorous historical accounting and modern analysis suggest that the financial corruption charges were largely royalist fabrications designed explicitly to destroy his reputation, Harrison left Wales with relatively modest personal wealth compared to other military commanders of the era. The sheer volume and intensity of the hatred directed at him proved one undeniable fact. He had successfully, systematically dismantled the old aristocratic order of Wales. He had utilized the supreme power of the state to enforce his vision of a godly society. But even as he consolidated his power in the West, Thomas Harrison kept his eyes firmly fixed on London. The fifth monarchist timeline was advancing, and Harrison was beginning to realize that the Rump Parliament he had violently installed in 1648 was rapidly becoming the greatest obstacle to the kingdom of heaven. The architect of the first coup d'etat was preparing to strike the government again. While Major General Thomas Harrison was enforcing his radical puritanical vision in Wales, the political situation in London was deteriorating. By 1652, the Rump Parliament, the very legislative body Harrison had installed by military force, had become a stagnant, corrupt oligarchy. The politicians refused to hold free elections and ignored the army's demands for social and legal reforms, focusing instead on protecting their own wealth and properties. For Harrison and the Fifth Monarchists, this was not just a political failure, it was a theological crisis. They believed the execution of Charles I had cleared the path for the kingdom of heaven. The corrupt politicians of the Rump Parliament were now the primary obstacle preventing the rule of the saints. Harrison returned to London determined to break the deadlock. He aligned with Oliver Cromwell, who was equally disgusted by the civilian government's corruption. On April 20th, 1653, the two commanders executed their second military coup. Cromwell verbally berated the politicians in the House of Commons, and on his signal, Harrison led a detachment of armed musketeers into the chamber. Harrison personally escorted the speaker out of his chair, permanently dissolving the civilian government without a drop of blood being spilled. The nation was now under a military dictatorship. Instead of seizing formal dictatorial power, Cromwell listened to Harrison's radical proposal. Harrison convinced him to bypass democratic elections entirely and create a new government based on religious purity. This new body was the nominated assembly, often mocked by history as barebones parliament. It consisted of 140 men handpicked by army officers and local churches, chosen for their godly devotion rather than political experience. For Harrison, this was his ideological peak. He believed this Parliament of Saints was the transitional government that would prepare the world for the return of Christ. However, political reality swiftly crushed the religious utopia. The assembly was an administrative failure. Guided by Harrison, the radical faction attempted to fundamentally dismantle English society by proposing the abolition of tithes, church taxes tied to private property, and the complete replacement of English common law with biblical laws from the Old Testament. These radical moves terrified the conservative property-owning classes. Recognizing that the country was sliding toward economic anarchy, the moderate faction within the assembly executed a swift parliamentary maneuver in December 1653. Arriving early before the radicals, they voted to dissolve the assembly and formally handed supreme executive power back to Oliver Cromwell. To stabilize the fractured nation, Oliver Cromwell accepted a new constitution and the title of Lord Protector. He began ruling with the backing of a standing army, operating a government that looked and functioned exactly like the monarchy they had just destroyed. He lived in royal palaces, knighted followers, and held extensive executive veto power. For Thomas Harrison, this was the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal. Cromwell, his brother-in-arms who had helped him execute the man of blood, had usurped the authority of God to place himself on a worldly throne. This directly violated the core tenets of the fifth monarchist cause. Harrison refused to compromise. He publicly denounced the protectorate. In response, Cromwell stripped Harrison of all his military commissions, canceled his state income, and banished him to Staffordshire. Over the next several years, Cromwell's highly efficient intelligence network kept Harrison under constant surveillance. He was repeatedly arrested and thrown into various prisons, including Carisbrooke Castle and the Tower of London, whenever the regime feared a radical uprising. Yet Harrison never broke, preferring the cold stone of a political prison over submitting to a government he viewed as idolatrous. The political stability of the protectorate relied entirely on Cromwell's formidable presence. When Oliver Cromwell died in September 1658, the English Republic rapidly disintegrated. The military and civilian factions turned on each other, pushing the nation to the brink of a third civil war. General George Monk, commanding the Parliamentary Army in Scotland, recognized the impending collapse. He marched his forces to London in early 1660 and systematically dismantled the Republic, recalling the conservative politicians who had been purged years earlier. This newly restored conservative parliament formally invited the exiled son of the executed king, Charles II, to return and reclaim the throne. In May 1660, the Stuart monarchy was officially restored. To ensure a peaceful transition, Charles II issued the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion, a sweeping gesture granting a general pardon for crimes committed during the civil wars. However, there was a specific lethal exception: the regicides. The men who had directly participated in the trial and signed the death warrant of Charles I were explicitly excluded from the pardon. They were marked for death. A massive international manhunt was launched. Recognizing the horrific executions that awaited them, the vast majority of the surviving regicides ran for their lives. Men like Edmund Ludlow fled to Switzerland, while Edward Whalley and William Gough vanished into the dense forests of the American colonies, evading capture for the rest of their lives. Thomas Harrison chose a fundamentally different path. When news of the manhunt reached him, he was at his home in Staffordshire. Friends begged him to flee, offering safe passage to Europe. He firmly rejected them all. His decision was rooted in unbreakable theological logic. To flee into the night would be to act like a guilty man. To admit guilt would be to publicly deny that God had guided his hand in executing the king. Harrison viewed running away as a betrayal of his faith. He intended to allow the state to arrest him so he could use his inevitable trial to publicly defend the legal and moral righteousness of the regicide. He simply waited in his home for the royal soldiers to arrive, surrendering peacefully when they came to take him to the Tower of London. In October 1660, the royalist government convened a special commission at the Old Bailey. They specifically chose Thomas Harrison to be the very first regicide put on trial. Because he was a notoriously unyielding and influential leader, the Crown wanted to make an example of him to shatter the morale of the remaining Republican underground. The trial was a meticulously choreographed piece of judicial theater. The jury was packed with staunch royalist loyalists. Even more cynically, the Crown appointed several former high-ranking parliamentarians to sit as judges, forcing men who had previously fought alongside Harrison to legally condemn him in order to prove their new loyalty to the king. Denied the right to legal counsel, Harrison stood entirely alone before 34 hostile judges. The state expected a fanatic rant, but Harrison completely caught the court off guard by unleashing a brilliant, razor-sharp constitutional defense. Bypassing theology, Harrison argued pure law. He declared that he had acted under the direct, explicit authority of the Commons of England, sitting in Parliament. At the specific moment the High Court of Justice was convened in 1649, the House of Commons was the supreme sovereign legislative power of the nation. Therefore, Harrison argued, no ordinary court and no jury sitting today possess the legal jurisdiction to judge an act ratified by the supreme authority of the state. Furthermore, he argued the legal impossibility of the charge. Treason is a crime committed against the state, so an action officially ordered by the state itself cannot logically be classified as treason. This argument was incredibly dangerous because it was logically sound, striking at the core debate over whether sovereignty resided in the people or the king. Realizing Harrison's defense could undermine the legitimacy of the entire trial, the chief baron of the court, Sir Orlando Bridgeman, crushed it with brute judicial force. Bridgeman aggressively cut Harrison off, refusing to let him finish. The judge legally established the rigid principle of the Restoration. The king alone is the source of all law. Therefore, the parliament that ordered the king's death was an illegal, treasonous assembly, and any orders they gave were void. With his constitutional defense entirely suppressed by the bench, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. The jury took only minutes to return a guilty verdict. Harrison was immediately handed the highest and most severe punishment available under English law. He was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The state had secured its conviction. Now, it prepared to turn his physical execution into a public spectacle of terror. On the morning of October 13th, 1660, the Royalist government prepared to execute its ultimate display of state terror. The punishment of being hanged, drawn, and quartered was a meticulously calculated ritual of political anatomy, designed to carve the king's sovereign power into the flesh of the traitor and coerce the English populace into total submission. The state expected a broken, weeping man to emerge from Newgate prison. Thomas Harrison completely subverted their expectations. According to the famous diarist Samuel Pepys, who stood among the massive crowds to witness the event, Harrison emerged from the prison gates wearing a brightly colored cloak and carrying himself with immense pride. Pepys noted with astonishment that Harrison looked as cheerful as any man could do in that condition. For Harrison, this execution was never viewed as a defeat. His fifth monarchist theology dictated that enduring such extreme physical suffering was a necessary prophesied trial, serving as the direct threshold into the divine kingdom. Harrison was tied tightly to a wooden sled, known as a hurdle, and dragged by horses across the jagged cobblestones and filthy streets toward the execution site at Charing Cross. The crowds lining the route were vicious, throwing rocks and screaming abuse. At one point, a man in the mob yelled out mockingly, "Where is your glorious cause now?" Remarkably composed despite the physical torment of being dragged through the dirt, Harrison simply smiled. He raised his bound hands as far as the ropes allowed and pointed his finger directly up at the sky. At Charing Cross, the machinery of state violence was deployed. First came the hanging. Harrison was forced up the ladder, the noose secured around his neck, and he was pushed off. However, this was a short drop, deliberately designed not to snap his neck, but to slowly asphyxiate him. The executioner carefully timed the drop, cutting the rope just before Harrison lost consciousness, sending his thrashing body crashing to the ground. The core purpose of this cruelty was to maintain blood flow to the brain, maximizing his capacity to feel pain for the punishment that followed. Gasping for air and in severe trauma, Harrison was hauled onto a massive wooden butchering block. The executioner stood over him with a sharp blade. First, he sliced open Harrison's abdomen and castrated him, a violent symbolic act meant to permanently eradicate the traitor's bloodline. Then, the executioner plunged his hands deep into Harrison's open stomach, grabbing his bowels and intestines and violently pulling them out. These organs were immediately tossed into a roaring fire pit positioned right beside the block. It was expertly designed to force a man to watch his own life force burn to ash while his lungs were still drawing breath. It was in this precise, unimaginable moment, pushed to the very limits of human physical endurance and severe anatomical trauma, that Thomas Harrison permanently etched his name into history. As the executioner was tearing through his internal organs, Harrison experienced a massive physiological surge of adrenaline, fueled by a willpower that simply refused to be broken. Instead of screaming for mercy or passing out from the catastrophic shock, Harrison suddenly surged upward. Using the last burst of energy left in his mutilated, dying body, he swung his arm and delivered a powerful punch directly into the face of his executioner. While the physical blow carried no real kinetic damage, its political and symbolic devastation was profound. That single dying swing of the arm humiliated the executioner and delivered a shocking slap to the face of the entire royalist establishment. In that split second, with his insides exposed to the London air, Harrison proved a stark truth to the monarchy. They could rip his organs from his body and burn his flesh, but they were utterly powerless to break his spirit. Panicked, embarrassed, and deeply unsettled by a corpse that was actively fighting back, the executioner abandoned the slow, agonizing process. He immediately grabbed his heavy axe and brought it down, severing Harrison's head and finally ending the life of the 44-year-old Major General. As dictated by law, his body was then chopped into 4 pieces, boiled in pitch to preserve the flesh, and displayed at the 4 major gates of London. His severed head was spiked on a pole outside the Palace of Westminster. However, the execution of Thomas Harrison sent shockwaves through the structure of British power, exposing the utter bankruptcy of terror politics. King Charles II and his advisors genuinely believed that the visceral horror of the disembowelment would paralyze the public with fear. They miscalculated human nature, because Harrison and the other regicides who followed him to the block in the subsequent days faced their horrific deaths with such unearthly courage and pride, it triggered a massive psychological backlash. The crowds that had cheered for Harrison's death on Saturday were, by the following week, watching the ongoing executions in stunned silence, awe, and eventually profound disgust at the barbarity of the royalists. The Crown realized to its horror that it was accidentally manufacturing powerful sympathetic martyrs for the Republican cause. Sensing that public opinion was turning dangerously against the monarchy, Charles II was forced to halt the executions, permanently suspending the public quartering of the remaining regicides. Harrison's story highlights the fatal flaw of authoritarian monarchies. Tyranny relies entirely on a monopoly of violence and the fear of death. When the state encounters an individual whose ideological belief is larger than his instinct for self-preservation, the apparatus of terror becomes useless. The state could destroy the meat, but it could not touch the man. Finally, though Harrison's body was chopped to pieces and fed to the crows, the constitutional argument he made in the Old Bailey did not die. He had argued that the elected representatives of the people held supreme authority over the actions of the head of state. At the time, he was laughed out of court and sentenced to death, but history would vindicate his legal logic. Just 28 years after Harrison's head was placed on a spike, the English people rose up again. In the glorious Revolution of 1688, the nation officially deposed King James II without a massive civil war. In doing so, they permanently established the bedrock principle of modern democracy. Parliament stands above the crown. The king is not the law is the king. It was a constitutional principle that a butcher's son from Newcastle-under-Lyme had defended with his own blood, refusing to yield until his heart was torn from his chest.